Hi, everyone, and welcome to Legal Management Talk, where we're covering every angle of legal management. I'm your host, Justin Askenazy. So I know a big topic in the legal industry where everything has to be done right now. It's a pressure-packed industry. But something that I know a lot of people are mindful of is the employee experience and what it looks like to support people in their jobs and make sure that they're succeeding, especially when it comes to the generational divide and different perceptions about what the employee experience looks like. So our guest today is Nikki Korson. She is the practice manager of complex litigation and arbitration at Paul Hastings in Washington, D.C., city that is close to my heart. First of all, thanks for being here, Nikki. Great to have you.
Yeah, Justin, thank you so much for having me. It was really exciting to hear from the ALA. I'm happy to be here.
I know that when we're talking about the different generations and perceptions of work-life balance, there's something that you talk about that I think a lot of people know of, but maybe don't know the name of, or maybe I've just been under a rock until recently. But it's something called the sandwich generation. Can you explain a little bit about what that is and how what that kind of translates to in the legal industry?
Sure. So I don't fancy myself to be an expert on generations by any stretch, but what I will say is that I've been working in law firms for 20 years, and I have noticed things along the way about maybe the way that I operate versus, someone who is of a different generation and what their priorities might look like. There's actually a really great book on this. It's called Generations by, you know what? I have it. Jean Twenge. Here it is. This book is great if you ever want to explore the different generations in the workforce. And I think what's important about the sandwich generation is you have folks who are now not only caring for the elderly generation, their parents, or even sometimes grandparents, but also children. And that's kind of unique to our current time frame, given the ages of the generations and kind of the strong emergence of women in the workforce at this stage of life. And so it poses unique and different challenges for families that are kind of facing that workload and work-life balance, right?
Right. So I know when you're trying to create that work-life balance, and it feels like there's a million tasks that you need to do every day, and everybody needs something, but then so do the people outside of work. So what are some of the strategies that you've used to try to maintain that separation?
For sure. I think the answer is there isn't always separation. When I was younger, I used to take the approach that sharing my home life was unprofessional, that I couldn't do that because it would risk my credibility or the gravitas that perhaps people expected from someone in my position. And then as I've gotten more seasoned, I've become more comfortable with the idea that I can do a good job, even though I have 4 kids, under the age of 8. I can still do a good job just because I have a family. Now, do I need to lead with that? No, but I often do, because I think normalizing that conversation and being comfortable with discussing some of your needs without oversharing are important. I think it manages expectations. I think it humanizes you. I think it connects you with folks who are in similar situations. And I have found great success in just being more transparent about the things that drive my home life. Secondly, exploring benefits packages when considering a company to work for on a new basis, right? If you're switching roles, or even if you're at a company and have been there some time, periodically reviewing that benefits manual to understand, is an elder care benefit available, right? Is there an emergent child care benefit available? I have personally encountered those benefits and have found them to be immensely useful at a series of different firms that I've worked for. And so it seems that our industry is also catching up, to the needs of those those sandwiched folks, right? And so being aware of what resources are available to you is important. And then for someone who has children, when you're choosing a school, whether it's a preschool or even an elementary school, understanding the schedule that goes along with picking up, dropping off, caring for your child, and making sure that that gets communicated, leaning on that number one point, which is the transparency piece, right? I think people in the workforce are becoming more and more comfortable understanding the needs of families. And so I think the only thing that we can all do that moves the needle is, again, to continue to talk about it.
Yeah. And I'm sure it's different once you're at a firm and established there, but during the hiring process, where I think a lot of people are very, I don't know if guarded is the right term, but very specific about what they share, whether it's on the firm side about what they share about what the full environment is at the firm, or on the employee side, where they don't want to. You want to give off the right perception, of course. So I'm sure it's a tightrope walk of what do you share, how do you promote that transparency without going too far at that critical juncture.
I mean, for me, this is a conversation about authenticity, right? If I were to be heading into a job interview and I didn't talk about the needs of my life, I don't need to mention I have kids, right? We don't want to trend into territory where we're putting people in a position where they're, faced with too much personal information. But I think not being honest about what my expectations and needs are as an employee is equally as distressing as hearing that you may be talking to an employer that perhaps hasn't been candid about their culture. So I, in the past, have found creative ways to raise the needs, right? Which is asking questions framed around, I mean, almost leading questions, right? Like, what are the expectations for night and weekend work, right? What time do people typically kick off in the workforce here? And what time do they typically pare down? How do you feel about commuting time, right? How do you feel about blackout periods in the day for commuting time? I think understanding that some folks have early morning commitments or even afternoon commitments for childcare reasons, or I was with a colleague once when she came in and her son had 4:30 p.m. football practice, I remember. It's just one of those things that she had to eventually share. But I want people to kind of get away from feeling guarded, because I think the time to have those conversations, to negotiate them, is probably post-offer, prior to the signature, right? Negotiate your terms, negotiate the windows where you're not available, explain them, make sure they're documented, so that before you come in, you've been transparent and forthcoming and no one feels misled. And I would like to think that happens in the reverse.
Right. And so I think that translates nicely into one thing I wanted to talk about, which is, of course, hybrid work and how that's taken a hold of the workforce in general, but especially the legal industry, where I think a lot of people are still trying to figure out the perfect recipe for how that works.
Right.
How remote to be, how in person. And so as you're trying to negotiate all these different responsibilities you might have at home, that also plays into your preferences in terms of how you're working, and what kind of work you're doing.
I think, it's like I'm almost turning on my guard, even though I just said don't be guarded, right? Because this is such a polarizing conversation. And I think people feel in the professional setting very differently about this. I can speak to my personal lens, but I think, and I hate to carve out a disclaimer, but I do think that the answer to this question very much relies on the culture of the organization to which you're posing it. I think that certain organizations, certain industries, certain experience levels lend themselves to stronger in-person needs, perhaps for training purposes. At least that's the argument that many pose. Then you have others who, we have entire industries that are outsourced overseas to call centers and things like that. So it's true that remote work can occur, but does that mean that there is no in-person presence? So does remote work mean you are away from the central office? Does it mean you're never in an office? I think what works best for me is having a blended opportunity, right? I have been in situations where much of my role could be done remotely, and yet I still chose to come into the office. COVID was a really great exercise in folks experiencing what it would be like to be fully remote, with the exception of the fact that I think culture was such a primary driving factor during that time period. Companies and organizations were sending wine to your house and doing home cheese tastings and trying to make sure that we stay connected. And we're no longer in that window, right? I don't think folks are pushing as hard to check on their employees and engage them at home and connect them, because now there is an in-person opportunity. Now there is the ability to come and congregate in the space. And I am a big supporter of that. I think it can be, again, polarizing. It can be lonely. And there's a lot of statistics that speak to when employees do not feel connected to the organization, it doesn't speak to longevity, right? However, I do appreciate that having the flexibility of working from home is also a really nice perk. I think there are a few bad apples that sometimes spoil that bunch. And so that will probably, lead into our next piece, but like, how can you work from home effectively? But I think we have to be careful to ask people if their home life balance requires them to work from home. Because when I work from home, I am exclusively working, right? I will sit at my desk between 8 and 9 hours, and I may get up to get a cup of coffee or grab my lunch from another room, similar to how I would behave in an office setting. Mm-hmm. It does not impact my personal life to work from home, with the exception of my commute, which, for me actually is a pretty big commute. So that piece is helpful. But I think that 8-hour, 9-hour time period should be fully dedicated. And I think that's where things start to get a little gray for some folks.
Hi there. This episode is brought to you by NetDocuments, the #1 trusted cloud-native and intelligent document management platform used by legal professionals worldwide. NetDocuments empowers law firms, corporate legal departments, and public sector organizations to organize, secure, and collaborate on documents effortlessly, wherever work happens. With built-in knowledge management, powerful automation, and AI tools, NetDocuments turns your document repository into a hub of insight and productivity. Learn more at netdocuments.com and find out how smarter work starts here. Yeah. So let's get into that. How do you spend those 8 or 9 hours when you're at home the most effectively? And then I think also another piece of this is, from an employer's side, how do you make sure that the employee is using their time effectively? Because I think a lot of times there's a disconnect there between how the employee is saying they're using their time, and then the employer actually knowing that they're doing what they say they're doing outside of the finished product that they turn in.
I mean, it's easy. How do I treat my day? I treat it as if I'm working. I mean, if I went into the office, I start my day, I open my calendar, I look at it, and I typically would figure out what my assignments were for the day. And this is for the last 10 years, right? That's what you do. You start your day by looking at your calendar. I will say, if I know I'm going to be in the office, right? During COVID, it wasn't an option, right? We were working exclusively from home. So everything was Zoom. So how did I make that work? Well, I might shave 5 minutes off one of my meetings so that I could take a 5-minute break in between, or grab a glass of water or something like that. When we transitioned back into the office, I started mastering the skill of building a schedule that was reliable, not just for me, but for the people that I work with, so that they knew which days I would be in the office. And that's when I scheduled all of my in-person meetings. And I tried to schedule as many in-person meetings as possible at that point, because it was an opportunity to reconnect. And I think there are a lot of cues that happen in person that really underscore a more successful meeting, right? There's nonverbal cues, there's body language, there's the ability to go grab a cup of coffee and connect in a different way, or maybe a walk and talk. And so you connect in more meaningful ways in person. So I think that's a strategy that I still continue to employ. I think when it's possible to meet in person, I think that's the better of the two.
Gotcha. Um, so I want to make sure we circle back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is the importance of having honest conversations and having those difficult conversations about your work, your needs, or whatever impacts your working experience. Um, can you share some tips about what are some of the best ways to make sure that you're having productive and meaningful conversations?
Yeah, I think, one of the biggest negotiation tips is that you have to be willing to walk away. Um, if you're looking for a new role, this is somewhere where you're going to spend the majority of your time. These are folks you're going to be breathing with, between 8 and 12 hours a day, right? And on the weekends and checking your email, these folks are going to be a big part of your life. And so I think sometimes when people are considering a new role, they overlook how integral this is going to be in their life. And it's motivated perhaps by the salary or the proximity of the commute. But that cultural relationship is such a big part of the job, and it can make or break your success there too, right? You can love the commute and love the paycheck, but if you get there and you don't click with folks or you're not good at the job, you're not going to be there long anyway, right? Whether it's your choice or not. And so I think it's really important for people to remember that it behooves everyone for you to articulate what your needs are so that they are met, because you will be happy in the long run. And don't be uncomfortable. I know that's silly, but simply don't be uncomfortable. If you say, hi, I really want to understand the hours here. Would it be possible to incorporate a 2-hour commute window for myself from 4 to 6? The worst they can say is no, but it's also the best answer, because what that means is that role is not a fit for you. And you need to know that before you get there, right? So I think when you're interviewing for a job, you need to remember that a huge motivating force really has to be the cultural components of the fit, because again, they can make or break your success. So tips and strategies, I think, again, be very authentic and sit down and ask yourself, what do I realistically need? If you know, for example, that, one of the elderly people in your family that you provide care to has, let's say, a physical therapy appointment every Thursday from 5 to 6. You don't need to say that's what you're doing, but I think you can articulate, my personal life, has needs that require me to be out of office beginning at 4:30 on Thursday afternoons. Do you foresee that being an issue? If they say yes, that job is not a good fit for you, whether you want to hear that or not, right? If they say no, I don't think it's inappropriate to say, would it be possible to have that documented in my offer letter so that we're all on the same page, right? And then you're covered, they understand, everyone's been transparent, and expectations have been managed. And I think that really is the building block for a successful transition.
Mm-hmm. Now, the clarity is so important. That's one of the underlying most important factors, and at least we're on the same page. Whether
Right.
Whether we like it or not, at least we're on the same page.
Right. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah, and so have you found that firms, by and large, are having that mindset of flexibility? Is that changing at all now that we're getting farther and farther away from the pandemic? Is flexibility still a major thing, or is that starting to wane?
I think it depends where you work, right? I mean, we see Above the Law is currently putting out, updates as to return to office mandates for different am law firms. Obviously, the mid-size and smaller firms are not necessarily being reported upon, but I do think there's still a range across the market. I have, a broad network, and I hear some folks are in fully remote roles. Some folks are in office 5 days a week. I think it's also driven by your position, the needs of a practice that you may work within or be embedded within or practice in. It's such a broad question. And I think it's really easy to pigeonhole the industry based on these return to office mandates, but they're usually far more nuanced than what we're seeing in the headlines. Um, I'd like to think folks are flexible. I mean, as I said, I think maybe I've been lucky, but I've had the experience where I've been able to articulate my needs and advocate for them, and I have found great success and enjoyed my own authenticity, where folks know me and my life and my responsibilities, and I lead with those, right? Um, I talk about my family openly. Now, am I sharing every time someone has strep or whatever in the house? Absolutely not. But they know I have kids and they know they're sick, right? So I think it just depends where you work and kind of what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. One size does not fit all, especially in such a big industry. So,
Huge, yes.
yeah. So I think that's a great lesson to leave off on being authentic and promoting that within an industry that can often seem cold or staid, but it's important to change that mindset. So I really appreciate you bringing that to the show and for being here.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. I hope this was meaningful to someone who might have been considering our industry or a change. It's can be a very great place to work, challenging but interesting. So,
Of course. And thank you to our subscribers, viewers, listeners for tuning in. Please be sure to give us a like or a comment on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel, and you can you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you can learn more about ALA at alanet.org. Until next time.